Eastern Standard Time. We are live with In Lieu of Fun, and we don't have Ben with us because Ben is experiencing extreme tech issues, which is why we're starting the show 12 minutes late. And I will not get into that because there's actually no story to tell because I still have no idea what's going on, and hopefully Ben will join us at some point. But in lieu of Ben and in lieu of a normal start to the show, we have Jack Goldsmith, who I've been bugging Ben to have you on for ages. But as Ben has said, we need something very specific to talk to you about. And so we are going to talk to you about slow motion coups and Jimmy Hoffa. And I kind of want to hear about the crazy deadline under which you and Bob wrote the book and how on earth you even did that in the midst of a pandemic. So why don't we actually just kind of start there?
You want to start with the After Trump book?
Yeah, let's start tell me about how you even pitched it.
Well, so After Trump is this book that Bob, Barr, and I wrote that basically came out in September, published by Lawfare. Yeah. And it's basically about what Trump revealed about the presidency and about its gaps in accountability for the presidency, unnecessary dangers in the presidency. In any event, we started writing the book in January, and we wanted it out in the fall. And for a variety of reasons, Lawfare, we decided, and we were very grateful that Lawfare would publish it. And basically what that meant is that we published it through Lawfare, but basically published it in Kindle version and in hardcover version, softcover version, through Amazon. And basically, to make a long story short, there are many reasons why we did this, including Lawfare's extraordinary editorial skills. But one reason was to overcome the 8 to 9 month wait between the time you normally send the book in and the time it's published. If we had done that, we would have had to have the book ready by February, and the book had barely started by February. Lawfare was amazing. We were basically writing up until about a week before publication, which is unbelievable.
It is unbelievable, but there's no reason that that I feel besides kind of the stodginess of the publishing industry, that there's not necessarily a reason that books need to take so long. And I'm kind of interested in this, and I know that this is kind of in the weeds, although everyone who's here and in the audience is kind of in the weeds, so it's a safe space. But I'm very interested, a lot of academics are you should, your next project should be a book. And I know this is something that people in academia go, a book is this kind of this thing. It becomes your calling card, right? And I do think that that's really true. But what you just described, the nimbleness of being able to write up until the day of publication, especially when I'm writing in tech, it feels super important to have that amount of leeway to go up until that very moment. You've written in both formats, right? Yeah. You've written multiple books. Would you write, do you think you prefer to write like that again? What do you think? Does it kind of change your mind about books?
Yeah, so first of all, let me say, I think it's important to write books if you can. I don't think it's necessary as an academic to write books. But writing a book is a very different discipline from writing a law review article or writing a blog post. And it forces you to think things through and make things cohere in a way that you don't necessarily have to do in shorter treatment. So I think book writing and some topics warrant book treatment and some don't need it. So I think book writing in general is a good idea if you can do it. I think it's a good discipline, and I think it serves a purpose. The problem with books is that, as we were saying, there's basically a 9-month lead in which you need to send the book in, and then you really can edit in the normal process until about 4 or 5 months before publication. But then after that, the book is set, and all sorts of things can happen between the time the book is set and publication. And especially writing about Trump, with things changing daily, if we had to put the book in March or April, we would have missed out on so many things, and we're really able to write until publication. So here's what I would say. I would say there are purposes still served by doing it the traditional way. I mean, Lawfare was extraordinary in being able to give us out A+ copy editing and A+ formatting and the like. But we had to forego, basically one of the things that advanced publication does, you send it out to the bookstores in advance. We weren't able to do that. You send it out to reviewers in advance. We weren't able to do that. Those are some of the trade-offs, but frankly, in our case, those trade-offs were worth it because we're still able to get a lot of publicity for the book. There's still a lot of interest in the book. There's been lots of articles written about it. I was on Fresh Air and the like, and all the standard places you want to be.
Yeah.
So we were lucky enough to generate quote unquote buzz about the book even without the lead time, but that's hard to do, and I think we got very lucky. And there are other advantages to going slower. It was a grind. It was an incredible grind of 9 months, starting from basically more or less scratch, through the whole writing process, through the whole copy editing process, the editing process, the back and forth between co-authors. As you say, that was in the middle of a pandemic, which in some ways was helpful because I had more time at home. But anyway, it was a great experience, and it turns out, it's a beautiful book. Amazon prints a beautiful book. It's not a hardcover book, but it's a nice book. They did a good job.
No, I mean, you could have fooled me. I think it's lovely. And honestly, my parents were, my mother in particular had been like deep in all of the books that were coming out around Trump, and I got her this because she needed something like to look more future focused. And that was kind of like, I was like, let's stop like tearing everything down and start moving towards like building something new. And I really like that focus of the book. And so like, I think it was like a really important tack to take. Did you conceive of the book before COVID? Just out of curiosity. So like when you decided the publishing schedule, it was like with the knowledge that COVID was there?
No, we had agreed, I can't remember the exact dates, but we had decided it needed to be published by September. We originally were going to try to publish it in July, and it became clear that wasn't going to work. And September actually worked out better, but that was all settled before COVID. And frankly, we couldn't have published it much later. It would have bumped up against the election, and it actually came out at a pretty good time as these things go.
Yeah, no, I think it came out at a perfect time, actually. Like as I said, like following kind of like the huge summer kind of deluge of like books that were all kind of tell-alls. I felt like it was a nice kind of, it was a perfect timing.
Ours was an effort to look forward, not backwards.
Yeah.
And the most appealing thing about it for many people was the title. I think the title sold quite a few books.
I mean, it was something everyone was looking forward to, right? And a lot of people were looking forward to.
Not everyone.
Yes,
a little more
not everyone. So let's talk kind of about that, like, and the slow motion coup. I have my distant family members and next door neighbor and like all of the rest of people who I have probably a lot of people who know people that voted for Trump and are still are like my next door neighbor who I love dearly is like still very much in the belief that this is a real thing, that there are missing votes, that this is like all happening. What do you think that this is like the president doing this, the Republican leadership that's following him? Do you think that it's grift, or do you think that this is kind of an actual threat in some kind of way?
You mean a threat in the sense that Trump is going to remain president after January 20th of next year? No. I think there's zero chance of that.
Yeah.
I understand why everyone was so anxious, and it's just like the whole Trump administration for 4 years. I think a lot of things people worried about, Bob Mueller being fired and Trump's enemies being prosecuted and a whole bunch of other things, were incredibly nerve-wracking, because you have a president of the United States saying things that no president has ever said, and he has the authority to do certain things. So you start imagining all these things happening, but a lot of the worst things never happened. And I just really wasn't concerned about a coup, because it's very, very complicated. As Ben wrote in Lawfare 10 days ago, it's very, very hard to pull off something like that when the votes are pretty clearly against you. There are legal processes, which I did not mind him taking advantage of. I thought that actually is going to lend, in the end, more credibility to the election. But all these sort of political strong-arming that he was doing, that's very scary stuff. But on the other hand, it would have been very hard to pull off. And one important thing about Trump is, and this is something that people haven't learned, and something Ben said at the very beginning of the Trump administration also, and a lot of people have noticed, is that he's exceptionally, he can talk a good game and he can threaten big things. I mean, you think about the power of the presidency, it's worrisome, but it's very hard to do some of the things he threatened to do, and he's never been competent at wielding the more complicated aspects of executive power. He can sign a pardon, that's pretty easy. Firing someone is relatively easy. The things that he can do in his office without the help of anyone else in the executive branch. But something like changing electoral outcomes that clearly went against him and that is largely under the control of the states. Anyway, I was never terribly worried, even though it was obviously discombobulating and nerve-wracking.
So what do you think his motivation is for doing this? I mean, is it what everyone thinks it is, which is basically just like attention and brand management and like riling a base? Is that the only thing that like all of this is for?
Who knows what it's for. It's very hard to discern Trump's motives. It like everything else, it's motivated by personal ends and not public ends, quite obviously. It has something to do with him. First of all, he just has a taste and a preference to attack institutions. This has been his calling card since the very beginning of the administration. He likes to, this is typical tendency of a demagogue, he likes attacking the institutions. He likes attacking lead institutions. He likes lessening their legitimacy. This is something he's done from the beginning, and he's always had a taste for, and he's doing it again here. I think he thinks it empowers him. He probably thought it gives him a chance to pull it off, and he probably thought, no harm, no foul to me, because it will, at least among a large chunk of my base, enhance this conspiracy theory. It's going to hurt Biden, which he clearly wants to do, which is a despicable thing since he lost to Biden. And it's going to hurt the next presidency. He clearly wants to do that. He clearly has some post-election plan for whatever, being out of power and making money and also having influences. And you must think that this serves that in. But Trump is, a lot of what he does is intuitive and not cognitive. And so who knows what he's doing.
Yeah. I mean, it does strike me as like, I understand Trump's motivation for doing this. I particularly think that like among his base, continuing to like stage some type of temper tantrum actually is incredibly burgeoning for like basically it just kind of like it's more of like exactly what his followers want to see. But I have a harder time with understanding why Republican leadership has been like giving him the time of day or giving that the time of day, especially that you just saw such a powerful kind of Republicans against Trump and Lincoln Project and all of these kind of these powerful conservatives and people on the right staging a pushback against the president. And I'm a little surprised, honestly, oh, good. Ben's here. Hi, Ben.
Hello, all. Guess what the irresolvable technical issue was?
Please don't tell me that you didn't have your computer on or something, or your.
Unbeknownst to me, one of the hubs that I use was not plugged in. I don't know why. I don't know how that happened. It may have, but I reset everything. I restarted the computer about 5 times. Just make sure things are plugged in, people.
I should have texted that to you. I had a feeling. But anyways, it's so nice to have you, Ben. Welcome to In Lieu of Fun.
Thank you, Kate.
In lieu
Good to
of
see
Ben.
you,
Good to see you, Ben. How are you?
I'm reasonably well. I'm better than I was 2.5 weeks ago, and I suspect will be better still 2 weeks from now.
Excellent.
So we were just talking about the Republican leadership and what their motivation was for like kind of getting behind this slow motion coup. And I was kind of dying to hear Jack's thoughts.
So I'm not an expert on politics, so take this for what it's worth. I don't think they got behind the coup. I mean, I haven't been paying a lot close attention to this. Some people raised a flag. A lot of senators said, let the process work itself out in terms of the legal process, which I agree with. I think that should have happened. I agree with you that a lot of the Republican politicians who should have didn't stand up to him when he was making really mendacious claims that were hugely destructive to the democracy and the legitimacy of the transition. But we see that happening more and more. What were the motivations? I mean, he had a weird grip on the party. And I think a lot of it was the Georgia runoffs. I don't know quite what politics are there and exactly what people are worried about. But I mean, I don't admire the politicians for not doing the right thing, but I'm not surprised by it. I think that most politicians are driven by what they perceive to be their short-term interests, and I think that they're all acting in their short-term interests, slowly but surely coming around. I don't pay close attention to these things, but it seems like on my Twitter feed and on the front page of the newspaper that they're slowly but surely coming around to saying that the president needs to move on. They're calling President like Biden. So it's happening, and would it have been different if they'd stood up earlier? I'm not sure how things would have gone differently. They should have.
So let's talk about that, because I've been puzzling about this as I've been trying to write this piece that you and I have texted about. I agree. I heard the whole exchange before, and I agree with you that there was never a serious chance that this. By the way, one interesting question here is what the right word for this is. It's not a coup, attempted coup, in that, like, there's no mobilization of military force, right? It's not a revolution. It is an attempt to hold power in the face of electoral dispute, or in the face of electoral defeat, without using. I mean, it's one interesting thing is that there actually is no word for this.
Yeah, no word, but he was trying to use legal tricks to overturn an election with a little.
But it's not just legal tricks. Like, I think it's to your
political coercion also.
Right.
To your point.
But let's just call it, for absence of a better word, let's just call it an attempted coup or an attempted takeover or retention of power, whatever you want to call it. I agree with you for reasons that I've written and reasons that I've explained on this show a number of times. I don't think there was ever a chance of it succeeding. And I think the automaticity of the process, that processes that the president by design does not control, kick in the moment people actually start voting. And that, these have an ineluctable logic of their own that is really powerful and really hard to argue with. And so part of my question is, so if that's the case, what does it matter if the president accepts the results of the election? What does it matter? Like, are we making a fetish of these kind of niceties of 20th century politics where, where the loser concedes and we don't actually avail ourselves of all these legal processes that are in fact constitutionally available, like disputing electoral votes and all that nonsense? And actually what happens is, but those things are there, they're real, they're available, and sore losers get to use them. And there's actually nothing wrong with that. So I feel in my bones that that's wrong and that we're on a very dangerous track here. But I don't have a great answer to that challenge. All right, so he disputed the results of the election and he's losing in Michigan and he's losing in Pennsylvania and it's not going to work. So there's no problem. What are your thoughts? Why is that right that there's no problem here, or is it right that there is a problem here? And if so, how would you articulate what it is?
You had something to say?
Yeah, I just think that, Jack, it's your article that you wrote at the beginning of the presidency about norms that I thought was I still say is the best article that I've ever written about what's happening in the last 4 years, which is that it's about destroying all of the spaces in between law and in between understanding of law, and that this is a perfect example. Ben, you kind of just summarized it really well, which is there's all of these things that is just sore loser, whose football is it? Let's, kind of this kind of bullshit stuff. and he's just using all of it. Like he just is using all of it, and like I don't know. That's kind of how I see it. Just continuation of Jack's thesis in a certain way.
So I don't have a terrible problem with the legal processes. I mean, I have pretty good faith in the courts, and as I said to Kate earlier, I think that the judicial processes and throwing out all these claims and having them addressed by judges and rejected is going to enhance the legitimacy of what happened. So I wouldn't have denied them making any argument they wanted in court, and I think they did make those arguments and they've been rejected. The lying and the lying about what happened and the attempt to coerce politicians into changing the clear mandate of the electorate is just despicable. I don't know what else to call it. Does it matter? Yes, it matters. It's great that it failed.
But okay, why does it matter?
I'm about to tell you. I don't think so. The part that matters. Well, let's just set aside the trying to coerce the electors into changing their votes. The sum total of that is, wow, reinforcement of the norm and reinforcement of the law. I mean, the law worked. The norms worked in the face of this incredible, unprecedented power. That's not the problem. And I wish he hadn't done it. The problem is, in my mind, is this effort to delegitimize the next administration. He's doing everything he can to weaken the next administration. Again, there's always a line here. Presidents often do things at the end of their term to put their vision into place to try to make it a little harder for the next administration to change it. But what Trump's clear aim is here, this is also related to the failure to allow the transition process to work. His clear aim here is to delegitimize the Biden administration as much as possible, to weaken it as much as possible. And his clear aim also, it seems to me, is to just enhance the hatred of the other, which is so terribly characteristic of our politics, and which he thrives on. So it seems to me that those are the two pretty straightforward things that are going to be achieved by this, and why it's terrible. And you listen to those, we've been seeing on Twitter and everywhere else these amazing concession speeches by all of the presidents and presidential candidates who lost, and it's just, and those things, it kind of seems like a cliche or unimportant. Those things are not unimportant. Those things are really important for bringing the country together, and which is obviously very important for a whole bunch of things. So Trump is just doing the opposite of that. This is what he's been doing for 4 years.
So I want to ask you about. Oh, sorry. Go ahead, Kate.
I just was like, do you think he'll ever concede, Jack? Because I don't think he'll ever have a concession speech.
I mean, if it's a concession, who knows? If it's a concession, I think it will be. Biden's going to be the next president, but I was ripped off. I don't think he'll ever be gracious, and I think he's incapable of graciousness.
So I want to suggest another reason why it matters, which I don't want to overstate because I don't know how to assess the likelihood or impact of it. But one thing I'm concerned about is violence. There are elected sheriffs in Texas who announced the other day, at least one of them, that he would never accept the result of this election unless Donald Trump told him to. And, you got a lot of people proceeding on the basis that there is an illegitimate action going on here that affects who runs the government. And a fair number of those people have guns. And I'm not a militant anti-gun person by any means, but if you have a lot of angry people who believe the election is stolen from them with guns, that is a recipe for a problem. And so, I guess my question is, whenever we have a violent incident in this country, whether it's the shooting of Steve Scalise by somebody who supported Bernie Sanders, or the shooting in Walmart by somebody who supported in El Paso by somebody who was a Trump supporter, there's always an attempt to link the most irresponsible statement that the politician made with the shooting. And my general attitude toward that is a irresponsible thing to do. There are crazy people, and crazy people do crazy things, and they attach themselves to whatever text they need. But here you have a situation in which the president is actively encouraging people not to accept the results of an election, knowing, he's sending certain signals to groups like the Proud Boys. And at some point, somebody's going to do something terrible and violent. And so one reason that I think it matters is that people are going to get killed. But I do worry that there's no way in retrospect to attach the incident to, just as like no hurricane can be attributed to climate change. There's this, no specific incident can you say there's a but-for cause relationship with what the president is doing now. And so I'm interested in your thoughts on the relationship between violence and civil strife and refusal to accept electoral outcomes.
I mean, we're going to find out. We haven't had a lot of experience with that. Look, I mean, I wouldn't limit it to guns. There are also, and I wouldn't even tie it to guns. There are all sorts of violence that can take place. It can take many forms, and there's all sorts of attacks on the government that can take place that are really corrosive to the government. And this is kind of what I meant when I said he was trying to delegitimize the Biden administration. He's trying to make the Biden administration non-legitimate, whether that's a call for violence, or your question is really, will we be able to attribute the violence to Trump? Did he incite things? I have to say, I've been amazed about how little violence there's been given his incitement for the last 4 years. I would have expected there to be a lot more, given what I read about certain groups and given what I've heard them say. And there's been, I'm not saying there's been no violence, because there obviously has been, but I've been amazed by how relatively little there's been compared to my expectation of how much there would be. I very much hope that will happen after the election. I don't know. I will say, to me, it seems like the events of the last few days, there's hardly a better way to discredit what Trump's been doing than the events of the last few days, where you have credible judges writing opinions, rejecting all of his claims. You have Rudy Giuliani, and I can't even remember the woman's name. What's her name?
Sidney Powell.
Sidney Powell giving that preposterous press conference. That there are a lot of conservative commentators who are usually kind of on board, or at least generally supportive, that flew away from that. Those were incredibly discredited. To have the election official from Georgia stand up and say what he did, these are all things that establish credibility in the face of the president's attempts to destabilize credibility, destabilize legitimacy. So there's a way to see the reaction to what's going on right now as actually as hopeful signs. I'm not saying I like the process, but then I don't know. I don't know about whether there will be violence or whether we'll be able to attribute it. Sometimes these events leave a paper trail. There's an explanation for why they're done. I don't know. I can't predict that. It's a possibility.
Yeah, Ben, I agree with your text that you just sent me. Just FYI. That sounds good.
So before we go to audience questions, let's so Kate and I plan the show while we're doing it by text. That's just the way the show works.
Yeah, I know.
The text read, let's ask about Hoffa and then go to audience questions, okay?
Yeah.
So right before COVID, you released a book about Jimmy Hoffa, your stepfather, and you. Didn't you
interview Ben? Didn't you interview Jack about this at the Texas Tribune conference?
Sure did.
Yeah.
But our history on this goes way back earlier than that, because when I first met Jack, he was still in his phase of embarrassment about Chucky O'Brien, his stepfather. He had just gotten a job, I met him when he was still at the University of Chicago, about 3 months before he got appointed to his Pentagon job. And he was still like renouncing Chucky at every step of the way to be viable politically. And
that wasn't my motivation. I mean, no, maybe it was my motivation. It wasn't my motivation to you, but actually, as I say in the book, it was Well, go ahead, finish your thought.
No, so I mean, I have watched this incredible transformation, and so I've never met Chucky, who passed away recently, but I have watched this incredible transformation in the way Jack talks about Chucky over it's 20 years now. I mean, it's like we met right after 9/11, and you know, and you went from being really embarrassed to be associated with him to being somebody who would go to the mat to establish that he wasn't who people thought he was.
That is correct. And I document that more or less in the book. I mean, not only was I embarrassed, I was antagonistic. I wasn't indifferent towards him. I was antagonistic towards him. I had convinced myself that he was a bad guy and that he would have been bad for me, and that a lot of it was kind of, as you say, and I was too quick to deny it, a lot of it was, especially once I went into the government, a lot of it was not wanting to jeopardize myself in the government. I recount an episode in the book where when I was just
security clearance.
Yeah, just after I arrived at the Pentagon for my first job in the government in the fall of 2002, I was trying to get a security clearance. I had had trouble with security clearances in the past because of Chucky, or at least there had been hiccups and glitches. And so this time I went out of my way to make clear to the people who were doing the security clearance I had nothing to do with him. I got a call from an FBI agent in the middle of that. The guy had turned out to be play a big part later in the book, a guy named Andrew Sluss, an FBI agent in Detroit. He at the time was trying to help Chucky and to try to show that he was innocent. I wasn't paying any attention to what the government was doing vis-a-vis Chucky, but Sluss was a guy who, contrary to the public story, had decided that Chucky did live and was trying to help him. And he called me and tried to get me to help Chucky take a lie detector test to clear his name. And I thought it was a trick. I was paranoid. I didn't help him at all, and I just wanted to get that security clearance. And so did not have a good view of Chucky, and I wasn't very nice to him. And the book is about the process of me coming to see that view as wrong and coming to grow closer to him, to admire him, to love him much more even in my adult years than I did in my teenage years, which were pretty intense love back then. And then this all happened in the process of me trying to figure out what happened to Jimmy Hoffa and what his role was in it. Because as you know, he was the leading suspect. He was the person thought to have picked up Hoffa, his father figure, and driven him to his death. So yeah, you were right. You were there for the anti-Chucky period all the way through the pro-Chucky period.
I have never seen in anybody that I know a more fascinating transformation in attitude toward a person who loomed larger in that person's life. And it was always like this thing about you that was like really interesting and distinctive. So I mean, like, to give the audience, I told this story in Texas, but I'll tell it again. You know, there was this time when an FBI agent showed up in my office to interview me for Jack's security clearance renewal. And ironically, the reason that Jack was long out of government, but he needed a security clearance renewal to keep cooperating with investigations of the Bush administration. This person asked me, like, have you ever known Jack Goldsmith to use a name other than Jack Goldsmith? And I said, quite truthfully, sure. He grew up Jack O'Brien. And this FBI agent was, he was a little bit flummoxed by that, because, like, you don't usually get that, you don't usually get the yes in response to have you ever known him too. It's a pro forma set of questions. But I knew that Jack had grown up as Jack O'Brien, so I said, yeah. And he said, well, why does he use a different name? I said, he changed his name when he was 18. And the guy says, oh, really? And I said, yeah, he grew up in a kind of a mob family. And the guy's like, "Oh, really?" And I said, "Yeah, you know, his stepfather was the principal suspect in the disappearance of Jimmy Hoffa for 30 years." And the guy's like, "Really?" And you can see he think this poor,
because you know all of the people asking security clearance are like these out of work like security guards at federal.
Yeah, they're all like contractors, and this guy clearly thinks he's going to break the Jimmy Hoffa case, you know. And I said, yeah, you know, he wrote about it in his book, and this was Jack's first book, and I pulled the book off the shelf and show him the page in the book where Jack describes this, and you can see the air just go out of the balloon. But it was like, that was like 2005, 2006. It's like, you know, it's always been a big like part of the sort of substrata of who you are, but it went from this very oppositional substrata to this really kind of like deep love substrata.
Exactly. And by the way, I have all the files on those interviews, and it's amazing how seriously worried the FBI was at various stages. Just on the substrata of the love, I mean, it's very hard to explain. I wrote about it in the book. He and I were very close. I mean, we couldn't have been closer, and I couldn't have loved anyone more than my teenage years and my love. And I just went into this mode in my adult years where I was kind of on track, doing well, and he wasn't part of it. And there's so much rationalization going on now. I see it like this way. But as soon as what happened is I described in the book because of my tough experiences in government, and I realized that a lot of things he said about his bad experiences in government were much truer than I realized. Than I thought at the time. It was a process. Once we got back together, once I got over my self-imposed, you know, basically exclusion, it was an amazing thing. It was just an amazing thing. And it was mostly his doing. This is a man with many flaws like we all have, but he's unbelievably good-natured. And we had so much fun together with some difficult times writing that book. And it was just the greatest thing. It was one of the greatest things in my life. It was really great.
I think I wrote to you after I started reading it that I was like tearing up, and even like the first, because you have this very dry, you're very hard on yourself, but like you're very honest. What'd you say?
Deservedly so, I think.
I think that there's lots of people who go through their lives and have these types of moments, and mostly what I felt so profoundly in reading the book was how happy I was for you that you found your way back and had you had the time and space to like reconnect with Chucky and like to have that. And I really was grateful for like all of the honesty of like the hard in between period, because I think that that's something that like you can gloss over it so easily. But I think all of us, many of us have like those types of hard moments with family members and with people where they disconnect, and it's so hard to pick back up and like reconnect because it means like confronting something that's really hard to confront. And I mean, in your case, for multiple reasons, but this was, I just was really touched by that book. I thought it was outstanding, Jack. It's really a wonderful book for many reasons.
You're very kind. Thank you very much. A lot of people, there were many things about the reaction of the book I didn't expect. And a lot of people had your reaction. A lot of people wrote me and said, thank you so much for being honest about that. It's made me think about my relationship with my parents and how maybe I should have done better and things like that. Not at all my intention. Like, I did try to be as candid and self-critical as I could. But anyway, thank you very much.
Yeah, of course.
Daniel, you are not in your usual chair, but you are wearing a black shirt, and the floor is yours.
Hi, Daniel.
Hi. I'll try to keep to the top question, which is, what actions by Bill Barr have shocked you or surprised you the most over the 4 years?
Okay, so I want to supplement this question because Jack and I are both people who were cheered at some level by the appointment of Bill Barr. And Jack, you actually stuck with Barr longer than I did. And, you know, like that there were potentially reasonable explanations for what he was doing. And so I want to add that as background, that I sort of subscribe to this as a challenge to all of us who supported Barr and who assumed the best motives for him. What is the part that bothers you most?
So I'll get to that, but I'm going to end by saying I still am less critical of Barr than the commissioner is. And I still think, although I'm very disappointed. Let me start with that. So at the most abstract level, I actually don't think Barr has been in the president's pocket. I think that's the wrong way to see it. At the most abstract level, Barr has been utterly either ignorant of or oblivious to what I would call the soft requirements of the office to portray himself as, the leader of a Justice Department that's even. Now, any attorney general is going to have an impossible time doing that when Trump is leader. And in fact, Barr lost it a couple of times, telling Trump in public, "Stop tweeting, you're making my life impossible. I can't make these controversial judgments, which are going to be controversial if you're going to be making it look like it's done through the lens of politics." It's exactly the way it was. He came out strong against Trump after he tweeted and congratulated him on the Roger Stone memo. Okay, to answer the question directly and then to say something that probably most people won't agree with. Of all the things that disappointed me, the way he conducted himself in the Durham investigation, I think was the worst thing. I'm not bothered by the unitary executive speech at the Federal Society or whatever it was. I'm not even terribly bothered, although I think it's politically terrible and not really coming of the office in context of the things he said about religious liberty and all that. I think that's fine for the Attorney General to say. And I think other Attorney Generals have given speeches like that. But in the Durham investigation, he, first of all, he just from the very beginning and in a very public way, he was commenting on and damning the people that were ostensibly under investigation. He was saying that he was implying wrongdoing. He said that they were traitorous, even if not in the legal sense of the term. He was doing all of the things that he would have criticized any other attorney general for doing. And it was just so obviously, blatantly inappropriate. I think the whole way he conducted the Durham investigation was the most disappointing. I thought, and I still think, and nobody agrees with me, but I still feel very strongly people overreacted to his first summary of the Mueller report. But you can't believe how much people overreacted to that. I think that the Roger Stone and Michael Flynn thing were bad judgment, and Barr clearly became convinced at some point. I think he clearly internalized the idea that there had been something like an attempted coup against Trump. I think he internalized the idea that there was a deep state that had been out of control and his job was to put the ship right. I think he exercised bad judgment about that. But I also,
what about the 230 stuff?
The 230 stuff?
Yeah. I don't know. Is that very low on your list comparatively with all the?
It's low on everybody's list except yours, Kate.
Yeah, I'm sorry. That's not. Sorry. There's so much stuff flying around about 230. I don't know. That's not high on my list. But let me say a couple of things in Barr's defense. It's not really in defense. Barr didn't do most of the things that Trump told him to do, suggested it. And he did push back against Trump on several occasions. And I suspect that we're going to find out, and I'm really not trying to defend Barr because I've been very critical of him, and as Ben said, I came out and I actually defended his memo on obstruction of justice. I still think that I'm right about that and that he was largely right about that. But I have come to be much more critical of him over time because he has been doing things that clearly were inappropriate in context, made more difficult by the president. But I do think this. I'm confident that we're going to find out all sorts of things that pressure Trump is putting on Barr and that Barr basically ignored or elided. I just think, and again, this is not a defense of Barr, but it is a defense of people in the administration. I think it's extremely, extremely difficult to be a lawyer in this administration with a president like that, obviously. And you have this tough call. We've talked about this before. Ben, you and I have both written about it. When do you stay? When do you go? When are you empowering? When are you keeping under control? I think there's been a lot more of people that have been demonized keeping things under control than we appreciate. Matter of fact, I'm sure there has been. And I hope that a lot of that comes out. How's that for a control answer? Pretty good.
No, I think there is, as you know, I disagree with significant aspects of it, but I also think there is a lot of truth to it. And this isn't, I mean, I spent a good chunk of time over the last few days in praise of Chris Krebs, who I think isn't, it's not in a lawyer role, though he is a lawyer, but he actually kept under control the U.S. disinformation and cybersecurity of election stuff. And one of the ways he did it is by keeping his mouth shut and, not talking about things that a lot of people would have preferred that he talked about. Well, I think in that case, that trade was really worth it. And so I think these are really complicated questions, and they're very hard to evaluate except with very specific facts about the role that the very specific individual played. And, I'm really glad Chris was there.
Can I say one more thing quickly about Barr?
Please.
If I had to diagnose what went wrong with Barr, I would say not that he became a lackey for Trump. I think it looked like that in some respects. That's not what happened. Barr has a very broad view of executive power, and his worldview was shaped in the 80s and the 70s. And he just wasn't prepared for the current environment. He was acting as if he was operating in the 70s and 80s and doing his thing, what he thought was right based on Article 2. And a lot of it, as I said, was non-violative of the Department of Justice, but a lot of it was just, you don't understand the context in which you're saying it. And if you do, you don't understand how harmful what you're doing is to the Department of Justice. Every speech he gives, I don't think he's lying. He says how much he loves the Department of Justice, how much he's trying to restore its values. I think we have to try to, in giving a complete picture of Barr, we need to try to make sense of that. I don't think he's saying those things correctly. I think he means them.
I agree that he means them, although I do think there is a quality of what he's done that is the combination of having your sort of personality and worldview forged in the 80s in the sort of post-Watergate era, but also spending a lot more time than I understood that he'd spent in recent years marinating in Fox News conspiracy theories. And I do think his openness to certain conspiratorial thinking is pretty hard to explain other than as a contemporary matter.
Fair, very fair. I agree.
Jim McGuckin, you get the last question today.
Okay, I'll be quick. Listen, I don't sleep, so I read, and I read the Mueller report, all of it, and then I also read the SCCI report, okay, and the difference is notable about Kilimnik and Manafort, and I read back Mueller, and he kept on saying, well, he can't prove anything that is, first of all, collusion is not really a legal thing, and I just want to, given the SCCI report, which basically lays out that you had the chairman of the campaign I'm going to call it collusion, with a Russian GRU agent. Do you think that your own opinion about Mueller's conclusion was a little bit short, or Mueller came up to it with too short of a conclusion about that?
I'm going to let Ben answer that. He's more of an expert on the SCCI report than I am.
So look, I agree with you, Jim, that first of all, you are absolutely factually correct that the conclusions of the bipartisan, universally, 100% of the members of the Intelligence Committee go far beyond what Mueller expressed on Manafort's role and engagement with Konstantin Kilimnik. And they do not amount to a conclusion that he was, operating in his campaign role in cahoots with the Russians. But it sure does conclude that he was operating in his campaign role to some degree in cahoots with a Russian who was a former GRU officer and was an agent of Russian intelligence. Now, does that mean that Mueller got it wrong? No, because Mueller is evaluating whether there were criminal charges to be filed in connection with this collusion. But, when you hear conservative commentators dismiss the collusion hoax, right, as they call it, or the sort of, talk dismissively about the collusion narrative, I think the Mueller report, and I wrote this at the time, and raises very serious questions about whether there was inappropriate, if non-criminal, interactions between the Trump campaign and the Russians. And the SSCI report only accentuates those questions. And I think the person who is most vindicated in this, if you look at all the books and you say, who's the person who basically lays out what their concerns were, what the anxieties were, what the investigative questions were, and when you look at everything that's been subsequently reported, you say, yeah, those were legitimate concerns, and that person is Pete Strzok. Honestly, I mean, people have all kinds of, say whatever you will. If you read Pete's book, he is describing a set of fact patterns that they were looking at that were, from his point of view, from a counterintelligence point of view, alarming. And if you read the SSCI report, the result, when you look into them, is counterintelligence information that is, in fact, alarming. And so I don't know that means that Mueller didn't do his job adequately, because Mueller's job is to figure out if you can prosecute people. But the job of us as a society is to look at that information and say, gee, this is not the way you would want a presidential campaign or a transition run. And I think that's, and so I would look at it ironically as a situation in which, by and large, the system worked. We got it exposed with one really important caveat, which is that a bunch of those people went into government. And, we had a number of days when Michael Flynn was the national security advisor. That's not a good thing from a counterintelligence point of view. So that's a longer answer than you wanted. But I basically think the premise of your question is correct, that the SSCI report really amplifies our understanding of this. I just don't think the fault lies with Bob Mueller, who was confined by his charter to look at criminal questions. And we are seeing that GSA, according to the chat, has now signed the transition letter.
This was something that I thought was kind of garbage. Like, they didn't sign it. Like, I don't know, I thought this was a little bit drummed up by the.
I don't agree with that at all.
Really?
The interesting question is whether Trump will fire her, and then what happens to what is the phrase in the statute?
Oh yeah, that will be interesting.
The phrase. What is the finding she has to make? I can't remember the phrase.
It's whether ascertain that there is an apparent winner. I think in light of the certifications today, it is both in Michigan and Pennsylvania, if it has not already happened, will happen today. In light of those, it was already appropriate to ascertain that there is an apparent winner, but now it is more appropriate, and now a transition can begin. At least
quickly, I know we're out of time, but do you think Trump fires her and tries to put in someone to reverse the decision?
No.
I think Trump will fire her because he's the sort of, I think it's the sex advice podcaster Alexandra Cooper has as her pinned tweet, the answer is and always will be block him. And I think that's kind of the way Trump Trump's version of that is the answer is and always will be fire the person, right? And so of course he'll fire her.
I
But-
don't think
Wonder if he'll take steps beyond that. That'll be interesting.
We will
We'll
stay
see.
tuned and find out. Jack
Yeah.
Goldsmith, you're a great American. Thank you for joining us.
Thank you for having me on your great show. It's an honor.
And Kate,
Yeah.
who is with us tomorrow?
Oh my goodness.
I think it's Jordan Ellenberg.
Jordan Ellenberg. Yeah. So
Yeah.
it's your good friend. And
My
grew up buddy.
childhood friend. I have
Yes.
known Jordan Ellenberg literally since he was born. Our parents were, my mom and Jonas Ellenberg were statistician graduate students together.
I love
Susan
that.
Ellenberg later became a statistician as well. They're all NIH people together, and Jordan and I were NIH brats together. He will be back talking about math and COVID and all the stuff that's going on, counting votes in Wisconsin, that sort of thing. And until then, Kate, that'll be 22 hours and 52 minutes from now. And until then, we don't have fun anymore, but we do have webcams if we remember to plug them in.
I was going to say the same thing.
If and only if. Apologies to all for the tech glitch, especially to Jack. And we will see you tomorrow.
Jack,
Great
thank
to see you. Thanks.
for coming.
Good to see you, Kate.